What's up, listeners? We are back for another special podcast. I have Adam Bruderly here, who is a certified executive personal coach who specializes in helping individuals align their health, wealth, and purpose to lead a meaningful life, right? And we're going to talk about how he got here. He also was in Tower 2 during the 9/11. I'm sure, that's part of your amazing story. And yeah, so let's just dive in, man. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming here. Yeah, when I heard your story for the first time, I was like, we got to get you on our podcast because our listeners are just going to find so much value in this. So thanks for being here.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So, just start a little bit. Like, where are you from? Where'd you go to college and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually born and raised Northeast Ohio. I grew up in Alliance, Ohio, which is about, an hour kind of southeast of here near Canton. Grew up like a typical kid in the Midwest playing sports and doing all the things. Ended up at John Carroll University up in Cleveland for college and went to graduate school there. And then spent about 13 years of my life out in the West. Mm-hmm. And then coming back around 2020, came back to Northeast Ohio. So kind of did the whole moving thing during COVID like many others did.
Yeah. So now you're back here.
I am back here. Yeah.
Gotcha. So where did you go after John Carroll?
Yeah. So I'll kind of maybe give you the long windy story, which will include the 9/11 piece of it.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah. So like I said, typical kid in the Midwest, went to John Carroll University. Like a lot of kids in college, you're there to kind of learn about yourself and figure things out. Got to school and became a finance and economics major. And I think at that time, and really just in general, the expectation is, especially in the investment world or the finance world, is when you come out, the goal is to earn money, right?
Sure.
That's not a shocking thing. I came out in 2001, which was right after the first dot-com bubble. I had spent a little bit of time interning with Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter at the time, and they offered me a job that included income, which my parents were like, you need to earn money coming out of college. So that was my first job out of school, was joining Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter. And again, like I said, many people at the time, success was going to be measured coming out in, hey, how much money do you earn? What titles can you get? Typical climbing of some type of ladder was what would equal success.
Yeah.
And
so you were excited. You were so happy you got that job. I'm heading towards this successful life, right?
Exactly. And a part of that was going to New York. And that's kind of probably where the interesting part of the story picks up. But I went to New York with what would be kind of a training program or an analyst training program. And at that time, Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter's offices were in the 2 World Trade Center or the South Towers. I think they were like floors, 15 to 20 to 70 or so, right? Those were massive buildings, 100 stories high. And I was working at that time on the 61st floor. And again, like I said, that typical mentality, right? When you're young, you're invincible. You're not thinking about, what could happen to me. Meaning as I've gotten older, right? Like my mortality is on the horizon at some point in time. And these are things you start to reflect on and think about. 22 years old.
Zero fear of death. Did you have a New York finance guy lifestyle?
Not really. I actually had just gotten there not too long ago. It was a little much for me as a kid who, like I said, grew up here. I had been on an airplane, I think, probably twice before the age of 18. We took one summer vacation to the Carolinas. I wasn't well traveled, to use that word. But kind of from that, that lifestyle perspective, right? I was, like probably most kids, I was definitely a knucklehead, right? Like I was doing all the things that you do in college back then and that you think about. And when I left school, like a lot of that was carrying forward, except for I wasn't doing some of the other things like working out. Definitely wasn't eating healthy. I was pretty good to take a $20 bill and head to Wendy's and get the dollar menu and get as much as I possibly could, right? The double bacon cheeseburger or the nuggets and the baked potato and the Frosty.
Yeah.
And,
back in the day when that was good.
yes, exactly. All the things, right? I actually was probably kind of 205 at the time. Just all the things that we reflect and think about. But kind of weaving that back, that was it. To be honest, like a good example of the kind of that pre-version was 9/11 was on a Tuesday. On that Sunday, NFL, right? NFL football had just kind of kicked off, and went out to watch football with a couple buddies. I think we got out at around 11:30. I ended up getting home at about 4 a.m.
Oh, right. So you went to the after party.
Yeah.
After Sunday night
my buddies
football.
had left, and I met a policeman and a fireman randomly wherever we were watching the games, and they're like, "Yeah, just come hang out with us." And I was
that's
like,
a good
"Sure."
time. At least you know you're safe.
Yeah. So, but I share that, right, because that was kind of my approach in many ways.
The lifestyle, right?
Yeah, and so that kind of brings me back to that Tuesday. And I was on 61, ironically, was in the break from this session we were in, using the restroom, and the smoke alarm went off. And right, you walk out, you're not sure what's really going on. Like I said, I hadn't been there a long time. And it was just the expectation, all right, it's a fire drill.
Just the fire alarm.
Yep, fire drill.
You didn't hear anything? You didn't see anything?
Nope. Somebody had kind of said something like, hey, they saw papers flying. So they thought maybe an incinerator had kind of blown up on the roof or something, right, or something of that nature. But no one knew in the floor building I was on what was happening. So you took direction of, okay, I'm going to head to the stairs and start walking down. Like I said, as a naive 22-year-old, I think, if I think about it's been a long time now, but I was probably like, hey, this gets me out of whatever I had to do for a while. So, sure, sounds good. I'll start heading down the steps. And you started walking, talking with someone. The steps were about, 2 people wide per se. So that's kind of how everybody was funneling down, and no panic, no kind of worry, just because I don't think anyone understood, of course, what was happening. And you kept going and kept going. At one point they did make an announcement, like you could actually go back to your seat. But as I said, naively, I'm like, I'll just keep heading down. And then I got into the low 40s, and that was the kind of the time or the change that I talk a lot about, because 2 things. It was 9:03, which is really relevant to something I talk about now and the things we do. But the time was 9:03, and that's when the plane hit my building. So I was on the 40, and all you felt was like kind of a rolling.
So just moving side
the building
to side.
moved. You heard the noise. And that's when you could feel panic set in that stairwell. You heard a few people scream. Again, I don't think anyone truly understood what had happened, but you knew it wasn't good in some form.
What did you hear? Just like a loud bang?
Yeah, like a loud noise, and it was really just that movement. And it wasn't like this massive explosion. It was just like, I don't even know how to explain it, right? Because you're in this kind of stairwell surrounded by cinder blocks, right?
Right.
And I was probably 20 to 30 stories below where it hit on my building, give or take. But it was loud enough to know it was a problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's not that many.
No.
30 stories below the plane. Wow. Yeah.
So I kept walking down, right? You could feel like the tension, the nervousness. People were definitely
walking
worried.
faster now.
Definitely walking a little bit faster, but moving as best as you could.
Yeah.
And it started getting into like the 10 and the single digits, and when you really started to understand what was happening, because as I was going one way, the firemen and the policemen were going this way, and you knew it was real. And as you kind of made your way down the steps, you walked out, and if anybody has ever seen those buildings or seen pictures now or any of those things, the lobbies were massive. They were huge. And you walk down and into there, and of course there was the first responders telling you, hey, this way and this way. But you could see it was, it was real, right? Like windows broken and stuff
in the
blown
lobby.
out. Yeah. And you started to really understand and reflect that whatever this is, it's extremely serious.
What were the first thoughts that were coming through your mind when you saw the lobby?
Honestly, again, I was both naive, young, and probably that extreme shock and surrealness. Because as I walked out in the building, because they wanted everyone out of there, you walked out. I couldn't tell you which side I came out on to this day, but you looked up, and that's when you saw, all the things that you see in the videos or the documentaries to this day, right? The buildings are on fire, the debris is all around, and you just saw kind of crowds staring up. And
Just everyone in shock.
yeah, I mean, really, it was just a deep sense of what had happened and how is this possible? Because I don't think, right? I think now these are all things that are in society or kind of like the lexicon of the world we live in, right? Like terrorism, these types of experiences. We see it, we hear it, 24-hour news cycles, right? Like we're aware of what's happening. But if you think about and you go back then, right? I mean, there was things that of course happened, but it wasn't as prominent and as real because I don't think we understood right? Everybody, I think that when the first plane hit it, I think I remember seeing in the documentaries and it's right. It's a mistake. It was an accident. It was a small plane. No one knew. The second one hits and
now you're like, wait a second,
this is real.
Yeah.
Right? And this is intentional. So I walked out and you got to kind of weigh and you looked up and you were watching it and, I stood there and again, back to what was happening. I think I started to process well, this is really bad. I don't know what's coming next. We shouldn't stay here. So I was staying in Midtown and, I don't think I had whatever was in my pockets. Because you kind of left your bag and whatever was up there and just started walking. And I remember, you started walking along and it was like you would probably see in a movie, right? Cars are stopped on the road, doors are open, radios are on. Again, if you remember,
people are just staring up
and watching. Right?
Were the streets smoky? Was there dust?
No, there was stuff around there and you could see it from above. But it was again, it's like if you watch footage of an old concert, on YouTube these days, nobody was filming on a cell phone or those things because it was the old flip phone. I think I had my first real cell phone at that time, a Nokia.
24 years ago?
Yeah, I had a Nokia or something,
phone,
something like that.
Yeah, you can't record on that.
Yeah, and the cameras were if you looked at a picture, it was looking at an Atari almost or something like that. But you just saw everyone kind of watching and staring. And so you kept walking.
You just kept walking, but the buildings haven't gone down yet.
No, they hadn't gone down. And I think, I like to tell myself that was something I had been thinking about. And again, not truly understanding many things at that time. I thought, well, what happens if it goes this way or something like that? Not understanding it was going to go this way, but not thinking they would fall either, to be honest. But I probably got, 4 or 5 blocks plus away, and all of a sudden you heard a rumbling, what sounded like thunder. And you turned around, and that's when you saw what was my building, which was the second one to be hit, but the first one to fall.
Wow.
Coming down. And then it was just what was happening. Reality was kind of setting in a little bit more. And again, like I said, cars are stopped, people are panicked, almost like that, when you kind of see someone where they're in that shock and there's they're looking at you, but there's nothing kind of there. It was a lot of those types of faces, how is this possible? And kept going. And what I think most people didn't realize is at the time, so the cell phone towers were on top of those buildings. Mm-hmm. So the minute they came down, cell phones stopped working. And there were still these things called payphones at the time. But there were lines 20, 30 deep for payphones of people trying to make calls, people listening to radios. So, I have this phone in my hand. It doesn't really function. I'm walking back, which is probably 2+ hour walk.
What's going through your mind?
Nothing. Honestly, just
nothing?
like
Did you keep looking back?
I kind of stopped, and I was walking with a few others. Like there was nothing to look back to. There was, I think, like just this struggle to process what was happening, a struggle to understand what it was or what was going on. Right? You heard people talking and you heard people discussing, but I don't. Again, and it is 24 years now, and we know from like research, like memories aren't great, of course. There are things I vividly remember and things I don't remember at all. And I think I was just like, I want to get to somewhere that it isn't here. So I kept walking, and it was in that walk back, right? Like there was this gap of time, and it was like kind of the ripple effect of that gap is kind of what I started to understand. And what I mean by that is like, as I'm walking back and that experience is happening, there's this ripple effect that's touching other people, right? So I came from a family of teachers. My parents were both teachers. And again, there was no X, there was no Instagram, there was no real, like, there was texting, but it was, again, very different. And what I mean by that is my parents were both teaching in their classrooms, like nothing, they didn't know. So, like I said, I grew up there. My family's been there for a long time, and grandparents were from there. So people knew who I was, like meaning principals and other educators in the system. And people in their buildings both walked down to their classrooms and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, Adam's in New York, right?" And they're like, "You need to come here." And they took them down and told them and showed them. And like the ripple effect, again, back to that meaning was like for that window of time before I was able to make a call, right? Like they didn't know.
Which was how long?
A couple hours.
Wow.
Right.
And you're in building 2.
Yeah, exactly. My wife now, actually, who was actually my girlfriend at the time, she was still in school at John Carroll. I was a year older than her. And the same thing, right? Like she didn't know.
Yeah.
Your friends and all those things. And like, there's that heaviness to that piece, right? Because I'm there and I know I'm okay, but there's all these other people who got put in a position that
for 2 hours thinking that you're probably in that building.
Yeah, you just don't know.
There's a good chance.
So I walked back with the people I was with, and we got back to where we were staying. And the first thing I did was pick up a landline and made a phone call. And I remember calling. I left a message for my who's now my wife. I left a message for her because I know she didn't pick up. And then I called my parents home. Mm-hmm. And they picked up, and I talked to my mom. And to this day, like,
what was
one
that
of those,
initial when she heard your voice?
Yeah, like that's one thing I vividly remember. Right, there's my mom, like knowing you're
just
okay,
in tears.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it took a long time to really understand what that meant until I had children. And I'm a parent of a soon-to-be 10-year-old and 7. And I struggle to even imagine.
Can't, right?
What it would be. Yeah, I can't, right? Like, it's like, there's just like that heaviness of like like you love your kids more, I think, at times, whether right or wrong, like than you love yourself. And I just can't imagine, right? Like, right. And so I think for a long time, I'm not sure I understood it, but I also know I like felt bad or regretted like putting my parents even in that position.
Yeah, but what could you have done different? Nothing.
No, of course, right? Like, and you have to let that go. But I think for a long time,
you felt that for a long time. You're saying,
yeah, because like the impact, I think, right? Even before when you and I were chatting for a few moments before, right? Like, in a society, we talk a lot about trauma anymore, right? And I think we're not, at times we don't understand how people carry it. And I think we all carry it in different ways, big and small. And, it's like I put them in that position, right? I understand it wasn't my fault. I get that. But still, right, there's a component of that I think I
you take it on so subconsciously, right?
Yeah.
And you're saying feeling a little.
I think I've over the years, I've come to understand, like, you kind of let go of that, right? That's,
Well, we're going to talk about that too.
Yeah. So I got back and got to the room, and you kind of like realize what had happened. There was just this sense of, I don't know what the word you would describe it. Not nervousness. That's not the best word, but there was this vibe, for lack of a better term, that, okay, they understood what happened, right? This was intentional. Here's who was doing it. Here's why they were doing it. But there was this like heaviness of, okay, what's next? Right. And we know, like, at that time there was other planes, the one that went down in Pennsylvania, and then the one that hit the Pentagon. Right. And I think there was also like, what's next? Like, is this coming again? Like, is this going to happen? And I remember, going to sleep that evening and getting up the next day. And to be honest, I've only been to New York we flew through there actually recently, but back into the city once since that day.
Why is that? Just finding it hard to go back?
I don't know. Like, I'm not a big city person. And it's funny, I traveled a lot. I've traveled a lot for work, and we travel a lot as a family because I very much believe in experiences and showing my kids like that there's a massive world out there. But I haven't really gone back. I plan on going and visiting the memorial at some point. I'd love to take my kids and my parents. But yeah, like, I got up, and the only things you really heard were like military planes, and like the city was pretty quiet. There weren't really people on the streets other than kind of, whether it was the Army or National Guard or whoever. Right. But like, it's hard to picture New York City.
Just a ghost town. Is
Yeah.
what you're saying. The very next day.
Yeah. Right. Like, cause everything was on lockdown, for lack of a better term. There was no real way in and out, right? They ended up using the ferry side into Jersey as like the base for the rescue and recovery. The bridges were kind of shut down. The airports were all closed.
Subways were closed too, or?
So what ended up happening was, honestly, like a couple days later, I went home. I was like, I'm not, this wasn't my permanent base. I took an Amtrak, actually, was the way I got off the island. I took an Amtrak out of Penn Station back to Pittsburgh. I think I got off in Pittsburgh, and one of my best friends, guy I grew up with since 6th grade, we actually went to college together. His girlfriend, and then, again, my girlfriend at the time, my wife now, was with him, and they picked me up and brought me back to my parents' house. And that was the kind of the start on what you just said, like a 24-year journey that I'm still on.
Sure. But once you're on the journey, then you're always on the journey.
Yeah. But it really became like what I would tell people is kind of a pre-version and a post-version.
So right after you came back, what changed?
I mean, a few things. I wouldn't say anything. It wasn't instantaneous, and it wasn't immediate.
Okay.
Right? I spent some time at home. I ended up kind of heading back up to Cleveland. I was still working for Morgan Stanley. Still going, started to go back in. It's 01. Whether you call it PTSD or whether we talk about therapy or any of those,
sure.
Like, mental health wasn't as prominent as it is today. I think that we could all agree on that. So, I wasn't like, I actually, wasn't seeing anyone. I wasn't probably talking about it.
You thought you were fine.
Yeah, pretty much.
You survived it.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I would say that I probably wasn't right. Like, of course, not shockingly. So I ended up starting to go back to work, but I wasn't there. Like, I definitely wasn't there. Meaning, like, I wasn't super engaged. I wasn't excited about it. I would say I'm probably going through the motions.
Do you feel like your mind was going back to that experience, or it was more deeper than that and you didn't even see anything?
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, it was there. The experience was there. There was still a sense of nervousness, actually, because I would say that fall, Ohio State played Michigan. I believe it was at Michigan. I had a cousin who went to school there, And so I was like, well, like he invited us up, and I went to the game, and we went to the game, and I honestly, I remember being there and being nervous, meaning a big crowd, group of people, like this space. And I think it was, again, what we were feeling as a country afterwards. Like, can this happen again? Like, how could it happen? All of those things. The same thing kind of came out in another example where Morgan Stanley ended up flying us to Dallas for an event to kind of pick up some of that training and that work we were doing. Mm-hmm. And I remember being on the plane, and there's no one, like, there was very few people flying at that time. And I remember sitting on the plane, and I'm there, and I'm nervous. And all of a sudden I heard like a beeping, and I started to freak out. And I'm like, what is this? And it turned out it was a guy's laptop, like battery low.
Yeah.
But it was like enough that it
triggered your body.
Yeah. Like, so what I mean was that was a good example. I couldn't sit here and tell you like this was specific, but there were things that were showing up in my life that told me I wasn't the best version of myself.
Yeah.
And there were other things. Like I said, I wasn't fully engaged. It's not like I started, exercising or meditating or, doing all the things to get myself right. It was kind of more like I'm just going to backslide back into my routine that felt comfortable in some form or fashion, kind of same habits and same things. And that was kind of like the first initial or gradual kind of reintroduction. I think what you're saying is like what changed. What really changed were, a couple things of a specific experience. I think it was that summer. My wife was headed off. She was graduating and heading off to med school in Toledo, and we were just dating at the time, and we'd been dating a while, and went through that experience. But I remember her vividly saying, I think we were the local community pool or something, and or something like that. And she was just like, I can't do this. Like, you need to get yourself together. So she could see it.
She could see it. You couldn't see it.
I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, fortunately, why I'm not sure, but fortunately that clicked. Right?
That clicked.
That was a click for me. It was one, right? Like I was like, oh, like I cared enough about her to take that and say, oh, okay, I need to move in a certain direction or begin to move in a certain direction. I need to take that experience and move forward in some form. Another one was, like we had went out one evening. I think she had headed off to school, and we went out, like we had some drinks before, probably had too many. And I was out, right? You just kept going, again, 22, 23 years old, right? Mm-hmm. And my buddies were like, all right, we're not dealing with you anymore. Like, you're full blown. I use the term knucklehead a lot, but you're in like full blown knucklehead mode.
You had a few too many.
Yeah, we're not dealing with you anymore.
Yeah.
And they laughed. And right, I think I was kind of by myself and ended up, pounding on some window, pointing at someone, trying to cause some type of trouble. Ended up sitting in the back of a police car, and two guys I went to college with came walking by, and they're like, hey, we know him. We'll take him. He's fine. He's good. And, that moment or that serendipitous experience, like I woke up the next day and was like, that's it, right? Like, that's it. There was a mix of those couple things, right? I'm sure there was a few other signs, but it was enough to know you are not on the right trajectory, or the right journey, to kind of come back to that term we talked about. And I started to make choices, and it started with, I decided I was going to look for a different job. I decided I was going to go back to grad school. And again, my wife now, Allison, said, like, why don't you just go? She was exercise, she would exercise and do all those things. And she was like, why don't you just go run with me? Let's go for a run. And I think we went out for like a 2-mile run, which probably felt like 10. I was terribly out of
the
shape.
first time's the worst.
Yeah, like the first time you get back into something,
Yeah.
it's miserable. But there was something about that misery that felt good, that run, and it clicked. And it was, those weren't all on the same day by any means, but it was compressed together. Like those things all started to click. And I'll be honest, it was the running component first that snowballed everything else for me. It was that sense of like something hard that I hadn't pushed on before or hadn't pushed on recently that kind of started to give me a little bit of a bug for lack of a better term, growth.
So after the first run, you're like, "Oh, I accomplished this 2-mile run." And then what? The next day, you went on another run, or
it may not have been the next day, but it started to move forward. I'm like, I kind of like this. So I started running.
Okay.
Started jogging. Started running. Went down the street from where we lived at the time and bought. I think it may have been a Borders, or Borders or a Barnes and Noble. After I had started running, and I can vividly remember, I bought a DVD, and it was a yoga DVD by Rodney Yee for like yoga for athletes or something like that.
Okay.
And I started like doing this yoga DVD in this old apartment we were in. Again, this is like the Midwest, Northeast Ohio in 2002 or something. And I started like trying that. And then I like this. And then it was like, I like this. Like, why wouldn't I try to do something else? So that's when I started like looking for another job, right? Like one with just something I would be more intrigued and wanted to do, probably just needed to get away. And I then kind of started thinking about grad school. And then one of the days I was out on a run, I ran into another buddy who was running. And like I said, I was living next to John Carroll, and he went to Carroll too. He was an All-American left tackle. But when I saw him, I'm like, that's not you. Because like he had lost 120 pounds. It turned out he had biked across the U.S. on this charity thing that he was doing. He lost all this weight, and he was doing this half marathon in, I think it was Wheeling, West Virginia. And he was like, want to do it? I was like, okay, sure, right? Like one of those experiences. And it was that one that then I'm like, okay, now I'm like training for something. Like there's an actual goal to start to accomplish. And then that was it, right? Like it started like, oh, I like this. You're training, you're running every day, and you're experiencing, and you starting picking up weights again, and you're doing yoga, and you're heading back to school, meaning just, you're getting back out there and pushing yourself. And like you're in a job and you have to have some structure behind it, meaning like you're either going to work out or before or after, because you got to get the run in, because you committed to do the exercise and school. And, that, to kind of like summarize a lot of that is kind of what started to create that snowball effect for me, because that run and doing that race then snowballed into the Chicago Marathon. And then that friend of mine talked me into buying a bike, and we started riding a bike. This was over time, of course. And that kind of personal growth, like spurred into riding the bike and doing other races, and then trying my first triathlon, which was an absolute flop, like last one out of the water doing the backstroke because I'm about to drown. But
still, you did a trial and you finished.
You kept going, right?
Wow.
And, my wife was in med school at the time. And I always tell people like that actual growth and kind of trying something new in the mental wellness component pushed us, because when she got out of school, we decided like, oh, we want to try to live somewhere else and do something different, right? So we ended up moving out west. And during that time, that's when the bug of career was moving forward, and the bug of like doing the hard things. So, the triathlon went to a half Ironman, and half Ironman went to a full Ironman, and then another Ironman. And then you get into racing bikes, and then, kind of got into ultra running. And this is again over a long-term, 15 to 20 plus years. But it was, coming from a world of like financial wellness, right? It was compounding interest over time, right? Like all of these things just compounded, and that in the work you do.
Yeah.
And all anchoring back to that moment, because what I ended up understanding was that moment for me, it was terrible, right? It was like for all the reasons we all know. But for me, it was the right time, right place. It was where I needed to be to kind of reorient myself in the direction I needed to go. And coming out of it, I had two choices, right? Like I always talk about inflection points. And if you see an inflection point, right, you can go up or you can go down. And for me, it was one that pushed me up, right? All the things that came from it, sent me in the right direction. And it's kind of brought me to here.
Oh, that's an amazing story, and it just goes to show you that our journey is specific to us to get us to this point of where you're much healthier, much happier. Look what you've accomplished, and podcast, and now you're incorporating your experiences into the financial world, right? So how do you help your clients? Like, what's your philosophy when someone comes in and they're like, look, man, I'm just super unhappy. I have all this wealth. Like, where do you even start?
Yeah, no, it's, so it all kind of came back over that journey. I always tell people like what I have built or what we have put together or the way I kind of work with clients was anchored in a tremendous amount of anecdata. So meaning like for 20 years, I was testing and learning and doing all these things. And it was like aggregating this data from experience. And then as I got deeper and deeper, what I started understanding is like, oh yeah, there's a lot of actually science behind it, right? Like it makes sense. Like we understand doing hard things often lead to resiliency and growth and, wanting to take next step and being, understanding that it's good to embrace the discomfort, right? Because in the discomfort we find growth and all those pieces. So it's taking that 20 plus years and overlaying it with kind of research and data and information. And the way we kind of bring that was, in my career path in that same time, I spent 15 years at Vanguard, the mutual fund company, and working with advisors and working with financial firms. And in those 10,000 plus meetings I had probably done over the years was, of course, the investments were a component, but what you started to understand more and more, hearing the stories or meeting, advisors, clients were, they had all the money in the bank or the success or the titles or the cash flow or the investments, the houses, the cars, the boats, whatever it is. But you would often find, right, there was a gap. Right? Like they weren't perhaps feeling fulfilled. They weren't flourishing. They weren't living their best life. They weren't, the authentic version of themselves. And there was a reason behind that. And if it wasn't the money component, then what was it? And what I started to find from that was, well, then what could we do, right? Like how could we give people the opportunity, the tools to live and be the best version of themselves? And, joining Journey and bringing that kind of wellness component is what we are trying to do. And we're doing it in a few different ways. It really kind of anchors to what we call the 4 pillars of wellness: physical, mental, financial, and spiritual, right? They are the foundational elements. Again, you do this work now, in my belief, like that's the foundation for a lot of things in our life, right? What I tell people is like physically, right? You can say, when I retire at 62 or 65 or 70, I'm going to play golf and we're going to travel and I'm going to play with my grandkids or do all these things. But if you're not making the choices now, right? You're not exercising, you're not eating right, you're not doing the things you need to do, then how are you going to show up as that version later on? Same mental health, right? Like we know those two are really tied together, right? When we talk about mental health, we often talk about social, emotional, and inner and world. Meaning like socially, like who are you with? Who are your friends? Family, right? It's amazing if you have all the money in the world, but you don't have anybody to share it with, right? Like, we can look at the data as a society in general. Like there's a large component of isolation. People don't have great friends or great friendships. Do people have 2 a.m. friends? Like if something goes really bad, who can you call, right? We know that they don't. It's in the data.
I thought you were talking about like 2 a.m. friends, like you're
No,
out
no.
at 2 a.m. You don't want those friends.
No. It's the ones that if you ever
Yeah.
need to call and talk,
Okay.
right? Like those are the ones who always pick up the phone. The emotional elements, right? Like, do you have the foundational pillars to be mentally healthy, right? To have good relationships, to be fully engaged, to have the tools to process the self-awareness, all the things you're experiencing, inner world and outer, meaning, like we as a society are often taught, like, you're going to find happiness outside from here, validation from others, compliments, being told you're the best, right? Being, oh, you're going to get this title or that title. It's right. But, those are wonderful. But if you're not like fulfilled in here, it's going to be a struggle.
Those are short-lived.
Yeah.
Very short-lived.
Financial, right? Of course, like there's that financial component of like money can solve a lot of problems, of course. But there's an important component of like, and these are the two things I really learned coming out of there. One, how do you define wealth? What is wealth to you? I think everybody has their own definition.
Yeah.
Like you could be wealthy in relationships, wealthy in friends, wealthy in family, wealthy in experiences. Of course, you can be wealthy, meaning assets in the bank. Mm-hmm. But I think we have to look at a much more holistic.
Yeah, wealthy, how you feel about yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And then time. And that's the really big one for me.
Time.
Yeah. I think it's the currency that, we should all be looking at because it's the one, and I get it, right? If we exercise, you can actually, there's longevity in those things, but or time is the real currency we can't make more of, right? Like you can actually make more money.
Yeah.
But,
and I think people have different perspectives of what time is too, right?
Yeah, of course. I tell people, like, for example, a good example is a cup of coffee, right? It gets talked a lot about, like, people who buy Starbucks all the time or all these things, right? Like you go in and it's a $9 cup of coffee. Mm-hmm. People will say, well, that's crazy, or that's a ton of money. That's expensive. But then we'll say yes to something that we just will flitter away 4 hours of our time. Like Netflix is a really good example, or doom scrolling, right?
Yep.
Like how much time people spend just flipping on social media, and then all of a sudden an hour or two is on. Auto enroll. I think the average is, on average, people will watch anywhere from 2 to 3 hours of Netflix, right? Because
that was the greatest thing they did for their business,
right? Like 2 to 3 hours, right?
Yeah,
just
yeah.
gone.
But buying a $9 coffee, which, because you're saving time making it yourself too, you're just running in, running out, and then going potentially to fulfill your dream.
Yeah, or I always tell people I go to the same coffee shop, and since we moved back, I go to the same one. And like I think I stopped there this morning, and probably had 7 different conversations on the way out. Saw a couple with their young boy who I talked to and watching him grow. Right, the same person, the barista, like 3 people in the parking lot. I know I live in this small community. Like, I'd love it.
Yeah.
Like whatever that cup of coffee is, and I buy it one for myself and my wife. Like, it's worth it. Yeah. Like the people I get to talk to and engage with and see on those days. Like, so I think time is a really big one that I talk a lot about. And for example, by the age of 13. And this is kind of loose research. There's a gentleman by the name of Tim Urban who has a blog called Wait But Why, who's kind of done some of this. Brilliant writer. But by the age of 13, you'll spend 75% of the time with your children. And by the age of 18, 90 in their life. And as a
90% of their life.
You'll spend 90% of the time with your kid by the age of 18.
And then the rest, that was
10% is the
you
rest.
You have 10% left with them after the age of 18. Wow.
Because when you back into the math, it starts to make sense.
Yeah,
right?
they're going to college.
They're going to college. They move
real
away,
world.
perhaps.
Yeah.
And you only see them, 2-3 weeks a year. 4,
That's a great point. Yeah. 10%. Wow.
As a parent of a 10 and a 7. Like,
mine's 13.
Yeah. Like
it's common.
Every time I think about it, it hits home, right?
Yeah.
And then if you want to play the math of days, like you can start to count the days, and it's real, like and it's something I think about all the time in the choices I make.
Because of your experience, right? So time, we can bend time, but it's also, we can even say time is like death. How much time do you have left, right?
You don't know when your last week is.
You don't know. So in other words, it's so important because you cannot take anything for granted. And that's what you talk with your clients about, right?
Yeah, that's a part of it. And then the last one is that spiritual element. And that's the one where it can make people feel a little uncomfortable because, people will gravitate to certain definitions of that. What I really talk about is like a component of self-awareness, self-interest, self-transcendence. And it's really that last one, meaning we are a part of something much bigger, right? And you can have your own definition around it, but you have to understand we are a part of a much bigger world. And when you start to embrace that, like you really start to feel a part of something bigger than yourself. Arthur Brooks, the happiness gentleman, I'm sure you've seen a lot of his work. He teaches a class at MBA, at Harvard in the MBA school on happiness. Great speaker, wonderful books. But he asked 2 questions of his students. For why are you alive, and for what are you willing to die? And like they're 2 beautiful questions, right? Like 'cause if you can't answer them, it's hard to anchor back to what I think that spiritual component is like, what's your why? What's your purpose? Why are you here? And I tell people like it takes steps to get to all those, and I'm still on that journey. But what I believe my purpose or why is to help others live their best life.
Yeah.
And that supersedes many things.
Exactly.
Like people will be like, well, what about your kids? I'm like, yeah, of course. I want to help them live their best life.
They're part of it.
Yeah,
Exactly. And when you help others live their best life, guess who? Our kids get to get those benefits too, and their kids and grandkids. Yeah, it's all a chain. We're all connected in that way, and that's why you came on to do this podcast, is to spread this message, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I mean, so like the work we do is anchored in the 4 pillars of wellness, and then we have underlying components with there, right? So I have what we like to call the 903 journey, and it's the kind of the coaching program, and it's not a cookie cutter. What I tell, there's exercises overlaid with coaching elements that we help people find those things within each one of those pillars. I work with families, I work with individuals, I work with entrepreneurs, executives, and then wrapped around that is kind of the team that I work with in the 903 Collective, which is kind of the wellness business for Journey. We work with precision health doctors, we work with therapists, we work with psychiatrists, nutritionists, trainers, right? Because as people start to tap into those 4 pillars, what they tend to find is that, then it's like, how do I anchor into a community that's going to really help me live that version of myself?
Yeah.
So it's really what I tell people is like the intersection of wealth and wellness, right? Because if you're fortunate enough to have the resources, the world can be your oyster. And you don't have to have all this money in the bank to live that way. But if you do, it does open things up in a certain way, right? There's for example, like, how do you spend your money? There's a wonderful paper. I'm going to butcher the title. But it's like, if money doesn't make you happy, you're probably not spending it right, or something of that nature. And the idea is like, how do you spend your wealth, right? And what they found in the research, spending on others, charity, right? Like charities, supporting friends, family, like great. Small purchases, back to that cup of coffee, right? Like, are you getting the cup of coffee, or are you there actually buying a cup of coffee, which is more about relationships and community and experience, conversations. And then lastly is actually like experiences themselves, meaning vacations, trips, ball games, sports, right? Like, who are you with? How are you doing them? What legacy do you want to leave? How are you, what's the experience? Because like we think of money and buying goods, right? But they find in the research that, it's around 6 to 12 weeks. So if you whether you buy a Lamborghini or a Kia, like that dopamine hit and that, hey, this new thing, it lasts about 6 to 12 weeks.
Wow, I wouldn't even think that long.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe a Lamborghini, but it would last that long.
But that's about it, right? But experiences can live
in memory forever, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, because isn't money just energy?
Yeah. I mean, it's, right, like, so, like with my own children, right? Like we try to travel or we try to do sporting goods because, it's someday I will be gone. Like it's real.
Yeah.
Like I wish there was some magic button or pill I could take, but it's not here yet.
Yeah. Well, your soul's eternal.
Yeah.
Just remember that.
But that's right. Like, and that's the memory I want to leave behind for them.
Yeah.
Right?
You're going to always be there through your memories and your soul, your heart, your connections. That's the thing, is we can't see it, but it's there, right?
And that's what I want them to remember, that, someday when I'm gone, maybe they're with their kids and say, hey, Dad, you remember Dad took us to this ball game and we went and saw this, or we did that, right? Or we went hiking in the national park, or we saw him do that race and running. And they're holding, a couple years ago I ran Burning River, and, just them being at like whatever, I forget what mile, like 25 or 26, and I'm changing out my shoes. It had poured all morning, and they're like, they could care less if I'd have walked away right then. They don't care, right? Like they have signs like, hey, Dad, like helping me change my socks out. Like they don't care if I finish. They don't care, whatever, right? They just remember like, oh, you remember when you did that and that experience? And that's it. And hopefully that's fairly clear, because it is unique and it's slightly different. But that's how I try to support others. And that's what we're trying to do with Journey and kind of the work we're doing outside of, like, we do the investment stuff really well.
Yeah.
But what we're trying to do is help wrap around and help people live like a holistic best version.
It's amazing. Absolutely. Because we've all heard that money, it's great. It fixes a lot of problems, but it ultimately can't buy happiness until you put those other components together, mind, body, soul, spirit. Like we're so connected with our businesses and what we do that that's the only way. Right. So that's amazing work. How can people find you in your company?
You can find us at Journey Wealth, www.journeywealth.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Adam Brutally. You can find us. We're kind of updating and building out the site right now for the 903 Collective, which is the wellness engine for Journey and the team, which will also include our precision health doctors, our therapists, our nutritionists, our other coaches, just trying to incorporate this big flywheel and, just really carry the same message and the amazing work you guys do. Same thing, right? Is like, it's hard not to feel good each and every day to try to help others. Like there's very few feelings in the world that can give you that. So if we can try to give that back to someone and I came out of a couple coaching meetings this morning, and like every time I walk away, you feel
amazing.
Yeah, you really do.
Yeah.
Like I probably get choked up or teared up more these days than I ever thought I would.
That's good.
But yeah,
that's that wealth. That's that wealth.
Feeling. Yeah, that's
that
right.
Additional wealth that can't always be measured or
like
seen.
It's hard to measure those goosebumps and that warm and fuzzy feeling.
Exactly. Well, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. I'm sure there's some goosebumps that our listeners have felt themselves. So I appreciate it, Adam.
No, thank you so much. I love the work you guys are doing. It's amazing. And I truly appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, guys, for listening. See ya.